Well, thank you very much, and thank you to everyone attending. I want to spend a little time talking about some of the successes in fisheries reform. I'm not going to give a technical or scientific talk, but if anyone would like more details of background science or technical issues, then I'd be happy to try to respond to those requests either after the meeting or through email. But I do actually think it's important to think about whether, or to think about the successes around the globe. I make no pretense to be an expert on fisheries in the coastal waters of Israel. I have done some work on Mediterranean fisheries, but more importantly, over my career in fisheries, I have had an opportunity to observe and sometimes participate in fisheries science and management efforts in different parts of the world. I mostly will talk about the United States, but there are examples from many other countries where people have tried to recover depleted resources and been successful, and there also, of course, are examples where people have not been successful yet. Well, the principles of fisheries management are really actually pretty simple compared to a lot of environmental issues. The first one is that no matter how much fish we would like to catch, the productivity of nature will be our limit. Every fish stock and every ecosystem has a limit to productivity. If you exceed those natural limits, whether you know them or not, then the resource will decline. And in general, it seems to be the case that if you reduce fishing pressure, then resources can recover. Now, that's not universally the case. We have some cases where fishing pressure has been released or reduced, and it's taken a very long time for that recovery to occur, but it does seem that natural systems often regenerate. So you have to balance the amount of fishing pressure with what nature can provide. And while that's a simple principle, it's not always easy to put into place in practice. The second principle is that we don't actually manage fish or ecosystems. No matter how much I've tried to talk to them, and I've done that probably too many hours in my life, they don't really do what I tell them to. Now, that's also true of fishermen, but we actually only have the capability of managing our own activities. We don't do a very good job about deciding how we want a system to look and then trying to create it. We're not very good natural engineers. Some people may dispute that, but at least in the sea, we can only manage our own impacts and then allow nature to take its course, as opposed to imagine that we can manage the systems themselves. It's really easy for fishing effort to increase, and sometimes it increases incredibly rapidly. It's very difficult to decrease, and that's for obvious reasons. Fishing effort increases because people have opportunity and they take advantage of that opportunity. That opportunity is to increase their food supply or increase their income or increase employment. Whatever the reason is, people and society is very good at responding to an opportunity. A new product, a new discovery of a fishing ground, which there's not very many of those left, a new market, or a new gear type. But it's very hard then to back away from that increase in fishing pressure, whether it be measured in number of fishing boats, the amount of gear or fishing power that they have, the number of fishermen that are working. It's always very hard to go back. Some people term that a ratchet effect, one that clicks forward, but you can't back up, much like a ratchet tool. And again, I think the reasons are obvious, but we always struggle when you've found that you've exceeded the limits that nature can provide. It's a simple idea, but it's probably the essence of actually trying to manage fisheries. How do you back up once you've exceeded those limits? in terms of actually implementing management, of course, fishermen are paying very close attention to any rules that might come with management, certainly to what's happening in the sea, to how it might affect their businesses. But I have to say, at least in my experience, the general public is not that interested. They may be interested in knowing whether the ocean is healthy or not, whether certain kinds of animals that they care about are protected or not. But the details of fishing and fishery management are really not visible to the general public. It's not something that you will get a lot of public interest in. They may be interested in the food that they actually buy and eat and serve to their families, but in the actual issues around management, less so. So what that means in practice is that usually fisheries management proceeds by having some broad overarching policy. In the US, our law says that you may not overfish, and that it defines what overfishing is, but it doesn't tell you how to prevent overfishing or to reduce fishing pressure once it occurs. It leaves that to the management authority, and that's as it should be. But it's, of course, the details of how you're actually going to reduce fishing pressure that cause a lot of the problems for both fishermen and managers and others, NGOs that are concerned in the process. So while we might want the public to be concerned, they're much more concerned about that broad issue of whether the ocean is healthy or not, or whether we're taking care of a resource or not, but not the details, and rightly so. A very famous, one of the sort of great men of fisheries science was a man named John Gulland. He worked for the Food and Agriculture Organization for many years. I had the privilege of working with him in London in the 1980s. He passed away in the 1990s. And this quote is from him: "Fisheries management can be an endless argument about how many fish there are in the sea until all doubt is removed, and so are all the fish." And the importance of this, and the reason I read it out, is that we can argue for a very long time trying to be very precise. Well, exactly how much fishing pressure can be allowed? Exactly how much catch can we take? Or exactly how many boats can fish, or what areas should be closed? We have to know everything in advance with very high precision before we can take any action. And I would suggest if you do that, then John Gulland's statement will certainly be true. By the time you figure all that out, you won't really need to worry about it. There won't be any fish. What that means in practice to be successful is that you need to start taking action. You also need to be able to adjust that action as you go, what's usually referred to as adaptive management. You need to be able to take action based not on full information, but on reasonable information. And I would say that in many cases, we strive for very detailed information really as an excuse, because we are afraid of what the action might bring. Well, there is no question, in my mind at least, that the oceans are under enormous pressure. I think we heard from the introductory remarks that that's certainly true in Israel as well. Fishing pressure has intensified across the world, but fish catches are no longer increasing. Even if you look at the global total, it is now decreasing, not increasing in tonnage. And if you think about what that means, it means that we no longer are finding any resources that we can exploit anew as other resources have declined. So we've really come to a natural limit globally. Now, locally, that's generally true as well. It is a consequence of what I just said. We can no longer really find new resources. Now, there is production from mariculture or fish farming that is still increasing. However, it mostly depends upon wild production for its food, at least for the finfish part of it, not for the shellfish. So we are seeing a point where we have to decide, do we care whether our ocean resources, our coastal ocean, is sustainable? We can't put off that decision anymore. And that's true globally, and I would submit to you that it appears to be true in Israel, again, accepting that I'm not an expert on the fisheries in your waters. Well, here's a very classic case of cod off of Newfoundland, the collapse of cod in the 1990s. This is the northern cod fishery that was exploited by the Europeans as well as the Canadians. The fishery almost completely collapsed in 1990 with the loss of not only a lot of jobs and a way of life in Newfoundland, but a huge amount of food resource. I mean, it was a 2 million ton, more than 2 million ton fishery at one point, and out of a global total of about 80 million metric tons, that's quite a lot for one relatively small area off the Newfoundland coast. And it didn't come back for a long time. It now has seen some increases. And there's been some fundamental change in the ecosystem in the North Atlantic. And some people, there's lots of different stories about why the stocks collapsed. There's all kinds of analyses. A friend of mine, a very, very good fishery scientist named Ram Myers, who passed away some years ago. Sorry to keep talking about people who are no longer alive, but that's what happens if you're a fishery scientist, let me warn you. Ram said it's pretty obvious what happened to the northern cod. We ate them. Which I thought was a pretty sophisticated scientific analysis. He was roundly criticized for that analysis because people said, no, something else must have happened, including my favorite rationale, which was someone proposed that they fell off the edge of the continental shelf, which I think is a little unlikely. But effectively what happened is there was an enormous pressure, political pressure, to maintain the fishery. An unwillingness to sort of read the signs that some scientists, many scientists actually saw that the fishery was declining, but incredible pressure to say, no, this really isn't happening, there must be something else going on, lots of other things going on that said, really, it can't be this bad until the fish disappeared. All doubt was removed, and so were all the fish. And again, this resource has been at a very low level for almost 20 years now, or more than 20 years now, and it's just starting to recover now. This is from a graph, and I promised I would not show very many graphs, but this is a graph from some of my work on the history of fisheries off of the northeast coast of the US and Canada. And the green dot in the upper left corner of the graph is what we estimate the biomass of cod to be in the 19th century. And the squiggly line down the bottom is the current biomass as of, around 2000. So we went from 1.2 million metric tons to about 50,000 tons of biomass. If anyone has any doubts about whether we have the capacity to really fundamentally change ocean systems, then look at that graph and think about the fact that at one point this resource was able to sustain 1.2 million metric tons of cod, and people were arguing all through the 70s, 80s, and 90s about how healthy the resource was, and we couldn't possibly need restrictions because the ocean would never be able to produce more cod than they were seeing at the right-hand corner of the graph. And clearly that just wasn't true. There's enormous productive capacity there. It just, we had just removed much of that capacity over the historical time of the fishery. And you also see that in the size of fish at the bottom of the graph of going from quite large cod, which were favored in the 19th century, to pretty small fish in the 1990s. I mean, these are not difficult signals to interpret. They're fundamental shifts in how productive the ocean is and therefore how much food we can obtain from that ocean. A similar example from Maine where, just a few vessels, a couple of hundred vessels in an extremely productive fishing ground were able to catch under sail. This is before they used what you might know as the dory fishery, but where they were sailing vessels, fishing relatively close to shore, caught 3 or 4 times as much as the mechanized fleet did in the 2000s. So we know that the ocean has the potential to be very much more productive, or it certainly had. And we know we have the capacity to really change the productivity of a coastal environment. My colleague Daniel Pauly, who's also a famous fisheries scientist and actually alive, working at University of British Columbia, has coined a term called shifting baselines. And what he means by that is that a fisherman will always assume that what they saw at the beginning of their career is probably, the state of the ocean before they got at it. And their baseline shifts. So a younger fisherman will see, if depletion occurs, a more depleted resource. So younger fishermen might only see those kinds of fish that you see on the right-hand side, whereas an older fisherman might see a much more abundant resource, might remember when there were tuna, much higher levels of tuna and sharks and other species in the Mediterranean, for example, compared to the very small fish and fewer species that you see on the right-hand side. And that shifts their baseline for thinking about what the productivity of the ocean is. And I remember another colleague of mine said once he was in a management meeting about tuna, and a young fisherman came up to him and said, you guys are crazy, we don't need to have restrictions. There's more fish out there than I've ever seen in my life. And my colleague said to him, yeah, but you're not very old. And that's true. I mean, the guy had been fishing for maybe 10 years, and so his frame of reference was, at that point, about the mid-1980s, and there weren't that many tuna then. But to him, there were a lot, because by the end of the 80s and into the 90s, there was almost nothing in New England waters. So we tend to shift our perceptions about what the ocean can produce. And here's an example of that from Florida. The top graph is a recreational fishing tournament in Florida and the winning catch. And so is the bottom graph about 30 years later. It's a little hard to see the scale, but trust me, the fish in the bottom graph are not quite as large as those in the top graph. But this was, the award-winning catch. It was considered outstanding in 2005, whenever the bottom picture was taken, compared to what was seen in the top. And so one of the reasons I'm showing, this is from a colleague named Lauren McClenahan, who works at Colby College. One of the reasons I'm showing this is that we shouldn't settle for just what we've seen in the last few years and say, okay, that's good enough. That's all we could get. That's our frame of reference. We shouldn't expect to be able to recover fisheries. I don't think the people were actually included in the catch. I think they just came along and got in front of the camera. We also know that we can really change things like tropical reef ecosystems or even subtropical reef ecosystems. And in less impacted or more remote areas where you don't have intense human impact, you can see quite complete. In the top of the graph pictures, you can see there's sharks, there's large fish, there's healthy corals. By the time you get to intensely impacted places, there's not much left. There probably are some fish there, but you can see a few in the picture, but they're pretty small. And so we shouldn't doubt that we have the capacity to really change these systems. What is fundamentally true in most examples is that when fishing pressure remains high, the stocks don't really show any recovery. That's not surprising. As my friend Ram Myers said, we're still eating them. So they never get to grow and reproduce to nearly the level that they might. These are all happen to be examples from the US, where you've seen really very little recovery. On the other hand, these are also examples from the US, and I'll show you a few more, when fishing pressure is reduced, sometimes in the same area, because in this particular case, for haddock, and cod was on the previous slide, they're fished in the same area, but some large marine protected areas that were implemented by me were much more effective for haddock than they were for cod. And so when the fishing pressure on haddock was reduced, the stock increased remarkably. So at the beginning of the period, just before we implemented these big protected areas, there was a trip limit on haddock of 200 pounds per day per boat, and the boats couldn't catch it. At the end of by about 2005, there still was a remaining trip limit, but they decided to take it off. But the trip limit by 2005 was 30,000 pounds. And it was no longer necessary. People were easily going to exceed it, but it wasn't necessary to restrict the trip limit to that level because the stock had increased that much. And so you can see actually pretty remarkable recovery. For sea scallops in the lower left, and I think they're on the next slide as well, a similar thing happened. They have the nice feature that if you close an area around them, they don't swim out of it, which is very, very convenient of them. But before the management plan went into place, a vessel to complete their trip would take 12 to 14 days. And the scallops, I'm sorry they're not kosher, but they're very tasty, would be about that size, what we would call 20 or 30 count. They tasted like the eraser on the end of a pencil after 14 days sitting in the hold of the boat. But you could still sell them. At the end of that same period, by 2005, a vessel could make the same trip for more tonnage in about 2 or a maximum 3 days. And the meat of the scallop was about that size, was worth a lot more money, and actually tasted like something came out of the sea as opposed to something off the end of a pencil, and was worth really quite a lot more money. And so again, enormous productivity that was just released by releasing fishing pressure by closing some large areas. And for swordfish, there was an interesting campaign. I mean, it's an incredibly highly valued fish, and in the western North Atlantic, if that call is for me, I can't take it right now. But there was a campaign by chefs in restaurants to ease the fishing pressure on swordfish because they saw the quality of the product was declining that they would get to serve in their restaurants. And that reduction, just by chefs in high-end restaurants saying that for a little while they were not going to serve swordfish for about a 5-year period, resulted in quite a strong recovery of the western North Atlantic swordfish stock, such that it is considered to be, if not fully recovered, in pretty good shape now. There are other examples. Mid-Atlantic bluefish I put on here, and Pacific lingcod, because they also have important recreational fisheries as well as commercial fisheries. And so it had to be a combination of recreational and commercial measures that we used to recover these stocks, which are now healthy. And others, including summer flounder and red snapper, which again have big recreational fisheries as well as commercial fisheries, that are making real progress because of management measures taken by both sectors. And that allows me to emphasize a point that I'll refer to again later in the talk, and that is you really need to address all of the sources of fishing pressure when you implement management if you're going to be successful, for lots of reasons. Some of them political, some of them practical, and most of them due to fairness. And so it's not sufficient to simply shift around the fishing pressure. You actually need to make sure that all of the different sectors participate in some way or another. Well, here's what happens when you, in one graph, when you continue to fish hard on a resource. Atlantic cod is an example. The size of the yellow dots indicates the abundance of cod at a particular location. And if you look in the top chart, you'll see that all along, this is where I live, so it's New England. Boston is sort of in the middle there. I don't have a pointer, but Cape Cod is this piece that sticks out into the Atlantic. You'll see that there were cod all along the coast of the state of Maine, out to Nova Scotia, all the way down to New York, and very heavily on this finger of shallow water called George's Bank that sticks into the Atlantic, one of the most productive fishing grounds in the world. And by the end of that period, in the end of the 90s, there were basically no cod in Maine, absolutely none south of Cape Cod, and they had contracted into only a few spots. But the reason that I show this graph, and I'm going to step away from the microphone for a minute to point out one spot. So I live here. I live where I just put my finger. That's Gloucester, Massachusetts, the oldest fishing port in the United States. And a fisherman going out from Gloucester, if you look on the two charts, would say, I don't know what you're talking about. I can still go to the same fishing grounds I've always been to, right here, and I can make a pretty good catch. And he's right. The top graph, 20 years before, you could make a pretty good catch in those same fishing grounds. Well, what happened? The stock just contracted into a few centers of the range. Fishermen are pretty good at fishing, otherwise they wouldn't last long on the water, and they know where those places are and can still make a pretty good living by going to those same places. But that shouldn't be confused with a healthy stock. It also means that fishermen are observing what they see in the ocean from their perspective, and it's hard to sort of step back a little ways and say, yeah, but is that what's happening to the resource as a whole? And you could argue whether it's necessary to step back. But I would guess that there probably are places where that's true. On the coastal waters of Israel, in terms of fishing, you could still do pretty well, even though much of the rest of the coast might have been quite depleted for those same species. And you sort of need to keep that in mind, that you need to have a stock-wide picture, and you also need to listen to the fact that fishermen are telling you very clearly where those important centers of the range are. Well, I guess I lied. I said I would show one graph, and here's the second one. But I have to show this one. This is what happened to the resource in that area. I have to show this one because I became the manager for this region where the blue line is. And so my job as a manager was to see if I could change the direction of what had been a very long-term decline in the resource for at least the 30 years that I was following it, but before that, a long-term decline, as I showed you before. And in the mid-90s, with a lot of difficulty, worked with a lot of other people to implement a management plan that reversed that trajectory. And this doesn't take you all the way out to the present time, but continued to increase for a number of species, including those that I showed you, haddock and sea scallops, but by no means was fully successful in recovering the resource. But it is possible to change this pattern of decline. It is not something you can't do anything about. There's no opportunity to really make a change. I want to talk for a minute about trawling. I know it's a contentious issue here. I know it's also a contentious issue in every other fishery that I've ever encountered. And these pictures didn't show up. I apologize for that. It's mostly the color that didn't show up. On the left-hand side, there is actually structure remaining on the bottom, both so-called biogenic or living habitat, as well as more complicated 3D habitat. And on the right, there isn't very much. And there is no question from evidence around the world that trawling can impact habitat, that it can have high bycatch, and that it can be a very powerful fishing method. It is also true that there are some areas where trawling doesn't have that effect, such as sandy bottom or higher energy bottoms. It's also true that almost all other gear types have some kind of habitat effect. At least I'm not aware of any, including recreational fishing, that doesn't have the potential, if done wrong, to have a habitat impact. So some of my colleagues would say, well, the only habitat impacts are trawling. I don't think that's correct. On the other hand, it is clear, there is very clear evidence that trawling can have a pretty big impact on habitat in many cases. It also can have a pretty big impact on bycatch, but that's true of other methods as well, particularly gill nets. Here's an example of, this isn't a trawl impact, but a real change in an ecosystem due to human coastal development impact. And the reason I put it up there from the island of Fiji is because we have to remember that fishing isn't the only thing that is stressing marine ecosystems. And I know that there are representatives from various ministries here, and it's important to think about how the activities that you potentially can affect within different ministries, and for SPNI and other groups to think about how you address those other stressors. It's not important, or it's not helpful to decide, which is the biggest stress on a system like this that has declined from what looks like very verdant or healthy to quite depleted. It's important to think about what that full set of stressors are and what you can do about all of them, if possible, as opposed to only just one. And almost finally, I would say that no one should ever pretend that fisheries management isn't going to be contentious. This is also in Gloucester, Massachusetts. There's a statue there called the Man at the Wheel in the lower left, and it's honoring fishermen who were lost at sea, of which there's been many in Gloucester over the years. This is much of the fishing fleet in Gloucester, so if you think that our fishing fleet is all these huge factory trawlers, it's actually mostly owner-operator 40 to 60-foot vessels. Mostly, at least in Gloucester, the community is descended from Sicilian fishermen, so they occasionally are willing to share their opinion with you in various kinds of language. In this case, they were sharing their opinion with me and with elected officials who are along the front here about concerns over some of the limits that were put in place that actually did result in some of this recovery. They actually included me in the picture. I'm the one on the right hanging from that vessel. My colleague Pat Kirkle is the one on the left hanging from the vessel to show their displeasure. These are contentious issues. I was working on, and you will be working on, things that affect people's businesses, their lives, their families. You can't expect that everybody's going to say, oh, okay, that's nice in Port Orford. And I respect the fishermen in Port Orford. I think I even knew a couple of them for what they've done in Oregon by getting together and deciding a set of measures. And I also remember from some years ago when I worked at the national level in fisheries in the U.S. that Port Orford was not exactly always willing to accept measures to try to protect the fishery, and they were much more of this mindset than they were in the film. And so, change is hard. Working through that change is going to be very difficult. We shouldn't minimize the impact, not only on fishermen, but of all of the people involved in the process, including the NGOs that are working to try to help make that change and the government agencies that are working to try to implement that change. So finally, just a couple of things to recommend to you. One is that, at least in my experience in the US and in Europe, and to some extent in Australia and New Zealand and South America, you're much better off trying to keep things simple. It's possible to design extremely complicated fishery management rules, which I have done, and they might work. But if you can keep things simple, then you're better off, in my opinion, because it's easier to make adjustments when you have a simpler system. So there's some principles that need to be kept in mind. You need to reduce fishing pressure, you need to protect habitat, and you need to minimize bycatch. And you have to do all three of those things. It's always easier to count boats and fishermen than it is to count fish. And so if you can figure out how you're going to reduce either the amount of time or the places that boats are going to fish, that's easier than trying to monitor very precisely exactly their catch. There is a place for catch monitoring, but I'm not sure it's the place to start, particularly in a complex fishery with many species in it. You need to be careful with the gear that's allowed within a fishery, because if you're not protecting habitat, then your recovery is going to be much slower the more habitat you lose. And you need to minimize bycatch, because then you're simply shifting around the fishing pressure onto other species, which is what happens in a pattern of overexploitation. Recovery does require real change. So I've been in many, many arguments where somebody would say, but we'll just keep doing what we're doing, but we want the stocks to recover now. And there's a famous phrase that you can't keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect a different result from Albert Einstein. It's probably the most overused phrase I just read on the internet that anyone uses in a presentation like this. But it's important to keep in mind that it is going to cause real change, and that change is going to be contentious. It's not easy for people to adjust, because it's not just adjusting, what they do on a particular fishing vessel. It affects their lives very directly. But that's the only way to get there. There isn't some magic path. If we could all write, nice phrases to the fish, and therefore they would read them and say, oh, okay, I'll recover, I promise, then that would be nice, but that's not how it works. And then the final note I would make is that the UN, that call's not for me either, is that the UN law of the sea refers to the ocean as the common heritage of mankind. And I actually take that to be not only true, but wise. And that is that, this is what in the US would be referred to as a public trust resource. The government manages it in trust for the public at large. It doesn't belong to only those who can access it. It doesn't belong to any particular ministry or any NGO or anybody in this room. It belongs to the whole Israeli public, and by extension, the world ocean, to the citizens of the world. And it's an important piece of heritage. It's not something to be dismissed or thrown away, and if you have an opportunity to recover that heritage, I hope you take it. Thank you.